Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar on COVID-19 vaccines and variants, brought to you by Suburban Diagnostics. I'm Dr. Vineet Nair, your moderator for today. For the next hour, we'll have a spirited discussion and Q&A session with some of the preeminent leaders in the field. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you want, whenever you want, by typing the questions in the chat box. We will endeavor to incorporate as many of your questions as possible in our discussion. Without any further ado, let me introduce our panelists for today. Our first panelist is Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who is a professor at the Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory in the Division of Gastrointestinal Sciences at Christian Medical College, Vellore. She's a prolific scientist and has published over 375 scientific papers and is on the editorial board of multiple journals. In 2019, she became the first Indian woman to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. Since 2020, Dr. Kang has been an ex officio member of a working group on COVID-19 vaccines established by the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts at the WHO. Welcome, Dr. Kang. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Our second panelist today is Dr. Rahul Pandit. He's a senior intensive care consultant with over 2 decades of experience and is the director of critical care medicine and ICU at Fortis Hospital, Mulund. Dr. Pandit is also the Vice President of the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine and is a visiting consultant at Bathurst and Wagga Wagga-based hospitals. He is an esteemed member of the Maharashtra government's task force on COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Pandit. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to your inputs.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Vineet. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Last but no way the least, we have Dr. Anupa Dixit. She's a pathologist and laboratory medicine specialist with 17 years of experience. She's at present the laboratory director and president of medical services of Suburban Diagnostics, which is one of the first private laboratories in India to be granted permission to give COVID-19 RT-PCR tests in March of 2020. Known for being a dynamic leader and a spirited speaker, she's been at the forefront of COVID-19 testing for the past year and has played a major role in educating general public and the healthcare community. Welcome, Dr. Anupa.
Thank you, Dr. Vineet. Thank you so much.
Without much further ado, let's move on to the what we have for the questions. So I'll just start off this topic. We've all been hearing about variants quite a lot in the the general cultural zeitgeist right now. So these variants are being caused by mutations to the virus. This virus itself is called the SARS-CoV-2 because it is genetically related to the SARS virus. So like the proverbial ship of Theseus, how many more mutations before this becomes a completely different virus? Or will it remain the same virus despite all these mutations? Dr. Kang, if you could throw some light on this.
So one way of thinking about it is that there are almost 30,000 base pairs in the genome of SARS-CoV-2. And we have the options of 4 different bases for each location. So if you think about the combinations, that winds up being, I believe, well over 1 trillion. So there's lots of room for change. At what point will the change be sufficient for this to no longer be called a SARS-CoV-2? I think drift doesn't happen that easily, because you have to have a certain proportion of conserved proteins that maintain both structure and function. So while SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV are related, they are actually different viruses from the same family. It's not like one evolved from the other. We've got lots of room for change, but how much change matters? We have to look at what the characteristics are that we are interested in. And I expect that in the next couple of years, we will have a good sense of how much change is possible. I don't think that beyond that, we will continue to see the rates of evolution that we are seeing currently.
Very lucid answer. So now we are having all these variants and many of them are being implicated in the severity of the second wave. Dr. Pandit, this wave we are seeing is much worse than the first one. There are reports that children and young adults are being affected more. We just saw news of a doctor who was fully vaccinated in the US with the Pfizer vaccine, who came here and contracted the infection and died of it. So why is the second wave so much more worse than the first one? Is it true that young adults and children are being affected more, and that this is more deadly?
So, Vineet, thank you very much. Look, There is no doubt about that, that this second wave which is there is seeing spectacularly high numbers than what we would have ever expected as clinicians and as administrators. Yes, as doctors and as scientists, we probably knew that the second wave is always bad, but the rate of rise has been very high. Coming to your question about whether the children and the young adults are affected more in this wave than the second, the answer is yes. And there are a lot of reasons. Some of them are just common sense reasons. Let me just address those common sense reasons to you. In the second wave, our children were playing outside the house. They were probably having their schools, which were started off in some places. We were having our economy opened up, as opposed to the first wave where things were tightly shut down and children were not actually venturing out of the house at all. So that could be one reason why there is a transmission seen in the children, because they were actually moving out of the house, stepping out of the house. And we all know how difficult it is for children to actually adhere to social distancing or masking. For the young adults, they were the ones who were running the economy. They were actually stepping out of the house to go to their work, maybe college. They were the ones in the local trains in Mumbai, which is the population between 25 or 20 to 50 years of age. So just by the fact in being more exposed and being in places which were likely to have more transmissibility, they actually had the infections. That's one of the reasons why we are seeing this. The second reason, of course, could be that is this the variant which is actually specifically targeting the young adults and the children. Now, I haven't come across any specific concrete data which says that this, yes, we have come across that there is a double mutation and there's a triple mutation, but with that double mutation, is it the young adults only who are getting infected more or not? I don't have an answer for that. Perhaps maybe Madam might be having an answer to it. Is it more severe? I think the sheer numbers are so high that we are seeing more critical patients. We had the severity in the first wave as well. We have the severity in the second wave as well. But yes, the young adults are actually quite critical. And I have a lot of 20s, 30s, 40-year-old who are in the intensive care unit, which I was not seeing in the first wave. Not even to the percentile change, which I would say. So definitely, yes, the second wave, we all thought that the second wave has got, majority of them are asymptomatic, which is true. But those who are critical, they are young as well. So I actually fear for that we are dealing with the virus, which is not only highly infectious, but when it does get infected and those people who are actually landing up being critical are having more destroyed lungs than what we have seen before.
So when it comes to these kind of infections, the new variants, are you seeing more number of reinfections? Is reinfection a possibility with these new variants, or is it just that it's a normal case where you will find reinfections when you look at a large number of patients? Are we seeing that increased number of reinfections with these new second wave?
Is that a question to me or Madam?
Yes, sorry, it's a question to you, Dr. Pandit.
Okay, so yes, we are seeing reinfections. It's not that we are not seeing reinfections, but the percentage of reinfections, fortunately, is not that high. I think patients who actually did not have any immunity, so those who were protected before and are completely unexposed before, are the ones who are coming in quite sick, is what my observation is. And a lot of clinicians whom I speak to also talk about the same thing. Reinfections are coming, but they are usually not as sick, requiring intensive care. So they do have a asymptomatic or a mild disease. Some of them land up with moderate disease in the wards. And not many have actually come into the intensive care being very sick. But the patients who are maximally, which I'm seeing right now, are the ones who have had one dose of vaccine. And then between the two doses, they've contracted the infection. And they are quite critical as well. And that's what really bothers me a little bit, that, the vaccination program should have been doing it a couple of months before, because we sort of hit up the peak and that's when the vaccination program is also run through. So yes, there are a substantial number of them. In fact, I've got doctors as well in that group who've not completed 2 doses. The heartening thing is all doctors in my institute, touch wood, I want to touch wood on that, who have done their two doses, they have been infected, but they've all stayed at home. They've not even needed hospitalization. So that's the good news right now from the doctor from the 2 vaccine point of view.
So yeah, what you're saying is that partial immunity from just a single dose currently is not effective, or not putting things at bay. It still gives or causing these severe infections.
What I'm trying to elude is that is there anything called as partial immunity at all, or you are completely as carrying no antibodies as you were before if it's just one dose.
Okay. Dr. Anupa, when it comes to these new variants, are we seeing any cases being missed? Is RT-PCR able to pick up these variants or these mutations affecting the capability of diagnosing these cases?
So, Dr. Vineet, this is a very interesting question. And since we have done over 12 lakh RT-PCR tests so far, the things and situation was very different earlier. What now we have seen is after the coming of variants, a lot of questions have been raised regarding the RT-PCR test missing out on the variant or not. But what we introspected and we checked with our kids thoroughly, what we realized is that variants are majorly affecting the spike protein. We all know that, right? So any kit which targets the COVID virus target gene as spike protein will or may definitely get missed out. But if you have a kit of RT-PCR which picks up target gene other than spike or has multiple
Dr. Anupa? I think she's facing a little technical issue over there. So we'll continue and get back to Dr. Anupa when she's back with this. To Dr. Kang, what is this immune escape that we keep hearing with variants? What is what is that phenomenon of immune escape? If you can just elucidate for the audience.
So immune escape would be a complete immune escape if you were infected or vaccinated, and then the immune response that you made following the infection or the vaccination was completely unable to stop the virus from getting in. Usually when we look at immune escape, we look by doing neutralizing antibody tests to look at the ability of pre-existing antibodies to block the entry of the virus into a cell culture system. So far, what we've seen with the variants is that the new variants have not a complete immune escape. They have a reduction in the ability of antibodies that were generated in response to the ancestral virus. They seem to be less able to neutralize the new viruses. So whether it is B117 or B1617 or B1351, we find that neutralizing ability is lower. Now, is it twice? Is it half? Is it 1/5? Is it 1/16? Is it 1/60th? All of this can really be measured only when you do a neutralization and you quantitate the ability of the sera to interrupt the ability of the virus to get inside cells. The good news is that in response to the vaccines we have, we actually make a very high immune response with binding antibodies and with neutralizing antibodies. And you need very little neutralizing antibody to be able to prevent severe disease and mortality. So therefore, all of the vaccines that we have, when evaluated in the lab, seem to show that in most people who made an antibody response in response to previous infection or to vaccination with vaccines that are based on older versions of the virus, are still able to neutralize the new variants that have come along. There are just a few examples of individuals in South Africa who were infected with B1351, in whom there was a lack of ability to neutralize. And now we actually have real world data showing that the vaccines are able to prevent disease due to B1351, B117, P1, And we hope we will have data on B1617 as well soon.
Can I ask you, have you any data on what would be the minimum cutoff or titer currently that a person? I know I'm pushing you on this, but it's too early. But I would like to know if there's any kind of preliminary data that would suggest even the slightest cutoff that people can.
So there have been efforts by the COVAX Watch team, which was established to evaluate vaccines, that has been trying to identify a correlate of protection. They are pushing very hard for neutralizing antibodies to be considered a correlate of protection. And it appears that a relatively low level of neutralizing antibodies may be sufficient to block virus infection. Unfortunately, the problem is that no two vaccines have evaluated the neutralization in the same way. They've used different viruses. They've done it as PRNT50 or PRNT80 or PRNT90 assays, or they have used pseudoviruses that have different backbones. So we really don't have a good standardization of neutralizing antibody tests that have been established anywhere. The only place that is trying to do things, or only two groups that are trying to do things where there can be cross-product comparison, is the National Institutes of Health in the US, where the National Cancer Institute established a set of assays and has evaluated samples from all of the vaccines that were tested under Operation Warp Speed. And CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, where they have set up a network of 7 laboratories across the world, where all the laboratories are using the same standards and the same assays. So with these kinds of efforts, we hope that we will be able to identify what can be either a direct correlate of protection or something that serves as a surrogate correlate of protection. But I anticipate that it's likely to take us until the end of this year before we have that as a standard assay that is available to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Kang. So Dr. Rahul, one question for you is, meanwhile, Vineet is going to join us back. Are the treatment protocols and the regimes which were set over past year still working the same way, or there is a variation which you have seen in managing the patients?
Okay, I think that's a very important question to answer. Very clinical though. I can tell you one thing, that we know now what works. We probably don't know what doesn't work very well. So what works, we know that oxygen works. There's a lot of echo.
Dr. Vineet.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think that's
the internet services here. I've had to connect. Yeah, so I believe we were speaking about the.
There's still some echo. We can't hear you, Dr. Vineet. One second. So maybe meanwhile, Dr. Rahul can.
Vineet, if you could put yourself on mute.
Put yourself on mute.
Yeah, good.
Right. Yes, Dr. Rahul.
So we know that oxygen works. So whichever way you need to deliver oxygen, whether you deliver it through a nasal cannula, BiPAP, NIV, or you deliver it through an endotracheal intubation, high flow nasal oxygen, whatever, you need to deliver oxygen to these patients. We know that the steroids work, and they have to be given at an appropriate time when hypoxia sets in, just before you master hypoxia by a walk test or exercise test. We also now know that prone position has shown to work in ARDS patients, and this is from the PROSERVA trial. And now it's almost going to be difficult to conduct a trial where you're going to nurse a patient in a supine position versus a prone position. And we know that in a certain group of patients where you see a massive rise in your inflammatory markers, you may require to give them some low doses of anticoagulants, which is a DVT prophylaxis dose. Or in critically ill patients, you may choose to give a higher dose. Okay, so these are the 4 things we know actually are what the treatment is based on. We know about the other protocols. We didn't have remdesivir to begin with in the pandemic when it started. We know that remdesivir now can probably help the moderate to severe patients by avoiding their hospital stay to get prolonged. So it shortens the hospital stay by 1 to 3 days. But that's the only antiviral we have currently. Though it has not shown any mortality benefit, I think we are going to continue using that for the moderate and moderately sick patients, not for the asymptomatic or mild, and not for the ones who have already got a multi-organ failure. Apart from that, the immunomodulators, the other immunomodulators apart from the steroid, which is the tocilizumab, the itolizumab, the paracetamib, then infliximab, there is a whole range of them. They've all got some data, but none of them is convincing enough, except that there was a data from the recovery trial which came out last week in Lancet, which talked about chances of going on a ventilator being decreased if we use tocilizumab with these patients early. But we also know that number of other trials before that and reasonably well-conducted trials actually have failed to show any benefit. So if you look at the treatment protocol, I think it is these four things plus remdesivir in that group of patients and good supportive care, whether it is at home, whether it is in the wards or a corona care center, or it's in intensive care. Nothing sort of supplements good supportive care. What creates a problem is when you deviate from your standard protocol. So if you need to intubate a patient in an ICU at the right time, do it when it is required. Do not prolong it. And don't use these other drugs as a substitute for intubation. The bevacizumab, the tocilizumab, the itolizumab, we are just using them for a substitute for intubation. That's not what we should do. If it requires to be intubated, you go ahead and put them on a ventilator. If they require to be on BiPAP, you go ahead and do that. Prolonging it is not going to help the solution. Find the solution.
Just one more question to add. What would be the indicators that a person or a patient needs to be admitted to the hospital? What is the presentation or the clinical sign and symptom which governs that the person has to be admitted?
Okay, so Dr. Anupa, in a classic scenario, anybody who has hypoxia or who has unmasked hypoxia by doing a 6-minute walk test should be in a hospital. That's almost a luxury right now, isn't it? If you find a hospital bed just for unmasking hypoxia today, in many of the states in our country right now, you won't find a bed right now. So, but the classic indication is hypoxia. Anybody who has got an uncontrolled comorbidity, which requires some form of a support for control of that comorbidity. So somebody's got an uncontrolled hypertension, uncontrolled diabetes, renal failure, they should probably be admitted in the ward so that they have a better outcome. And of late, we are seeing extra pulmonary symptoms, which have always been there. So GI symptoms, some of them present with neurological symptoms, some of them present with heart symptoms like myocarditis. They all need to be admitted. But the good thing is that majority of them, around 85 to 88% of them, have no or mild symptoms. They all can be taken care at home. Hypoxia still remains the most common reason why people would be admitted to the hospital.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Vineet.
Yeah, sorry about the interruption. So one question again I would like to ask Dr. Rahul Pandit, I don't know if this has been addressed in the meantime, is that I've been hearing from many radiologists that when it comes to follow-up of treatment, especially for radiological investigations, HRCT may not be as required as it's currently mentioned. That X-rays can be used as follow-up because they have less radiation, that they are cheaper, that they are much more easily available, and they can be done faster. So, what is your take on it? HRCT is still the gold, and you absolutely have to have it, or can X-rays be used as a substitute?
I'm not even going to talk on the radiation aspect because we heard what happened with the radiation aspect there. Yes, but let's talk the clinical and practical aspect. When would I do a CT scan? Okay, and when I think most radiologists would agree with that. So if I have flu-like symptoms or influenza-like illness, and I do a proper 48 hours window 2 RT-PCR test, and I still find that both of them are negative, and as a clinician, I'm still struggling to find a diagnosis for this patient, I would probably request a CT scan after day 5 or day 6, not before that. So that if there is a GGO, I might still do a diagnosis because CT scan is around 85 to 90% sensitive than a RT-PCR. 2, when I find that this patient has become unreasonably hypoxic very, very quickly? Am I looking at just the worsening of the disease, or am I looking at some other parenchymal infection or lesion which I should be looking for? So if I'm seeking more information, I would do a CT scan. If I'm thinking that this could be a pulmonary embolism, I would do a CT scan. I would not routinely do a CT scan on admission to a hospital. I would not routinely do a CT scan on as a follow-up. I would probably do a CT scan if I suspect that this patient is progressing towards a fibrosis. Then to start the treatment for fibrosis, I would do it as a follow-up scan, but not as routine. The day 1 scan, day 5 scan, day 15 scan. No radiologist is saying that as well. Radiologists are agreeing with the REMS of this, that majority of information can be sought from a chest X-ray, and chest X-ray can also be scored. Well, CT scans are also scored, but I think the major part we need to understand that CT scans are not required to be done at all. If you give me a minute, I want to talk about the scoring as well. See, a lot of admissions are actually panic admissions because they did the CT scan before and then the CT scan done later. He's showing a score severity index which has worsened, and patients obviously feel panic. They are not unwell, or they are not more unwell than what they were before, but they feel that the score has worsened, so they need to get admitted in the hospital. So I would suggest that leave that to the clinician to decide whether that score has to be taken into account, or you are actually clinically well and that score is just a reflection of the pneumonia getting organized. Because if you put up a ice cube on the lung and do a chest CT, it will look like a GGO. So let's say that GGO is there as a part of a mnemonic process from COVID-19. 4 or 5 days time, as the ice cube would melt, so would the GGO get organized as well. It would spread across. Okay, I'm just giving an analogy of ice cube to a GGO, and you would see a much bigger patch on the CT, which would then obviously look like the CT has worsened and the score has become high. But a doctor would be able to see through it and say, yes, your patch looked worse, but your oxygenation is better, your other symptoms are good, your CRP has come down, or you're clinically having no hypoxia. I don't think we need to worry about it. This kind of understanding has to go across. Just looking at the score is not going to help us.
Fair enough. There is another question that's been asked. Does nebulization have any role in treating patients of COVID?
Okay, so nebulization as such as a procedure is harmful, is what we all believe, because it sort of causes aerosolization, and that's not something which we want to promote in any closed ICU or a ward or anywhere. But yes, the recent there have been 2 trials which have talked about inhaled budesonide through a spacer or through the puffs, which does not cause any aerosolization, and for mild disease, mild symptoms, it has shown to improve the recovery time as well as avoid hospitalization. So inhaled budesonide in the dose of around 800 micrograms twice a day is what the trial has talked about. Any other form of nebulization should only be limited or should only be done if there are symptoms. So if there's somebody who is an asthmatic or who has a bronchospasm, by all means give them an Asthalin puffer or a spacer. But nebulization as such as a procedure is a very aerosolizing procedure, which all of us as doctors want to be bringing it down to minimum or not doing it at all if we can.
Fair enough. I'd just like to go slightly off track a little bit to Dr. Kang. This question is to you. Given the fact that many people are taking antibiotics for COVID, antimicrobial coverage is being given to patients at hospitals. In fact, one study was showing that in the US, where only around 7% of COVID patients had a bacterial infection coexisting or subsequent to the COVID infection, more than 70% were being given antimicrobial coverage. I believe around 70%. I don't remember the exact figures. Azithromycin again is being taken by many people because they believe it has a direct effect on the virus itself. So my question to you is, with such ramped up use of antibiotics, do you have concerns of these antibiotics, antibiotic resistance for other organisms and for other, uses ramping up? Do you see that kind of spiking happening?
Well, I think anytime you increase the global usage of antibiotics, you create a situation, particularly with microbes in the gut, that they will acquire resistance genes. So in this situation, ordinarily, if it was a a seasonal illness for which there was over treatment with antibiotics, I wouldn't worry so much. But right now we are in a situation where there is a lot more illness around, and irrational antibiotic usage could easily lead to resistance. The problem, of course, is we won't detect it until after it's happened. So yes, it is something that I think we should worry about. It's certainly something where we need for people to understand that if there is no secondary bacterial infection, you should not be looking at giving antibiotics. Azithromycin does have a direct anti-inflammatory effect in addition to its action on bacteria, but I don't think that any of the studies that have been done so far recommend it as treatment for SARS-CoV-2.
Speaking of long-term effects of this or effects after COVID, Dr. Pandit, what is your opinion about long COVID? How have you seen it present? And is there something that as regular physicians should keep in mind, or any kind of physiotherapy and post-COVID rehabilitation that can be done for these patients?
I think again a very pertinent question, Vineet. There are a lot of problems which are there, which we see as long COVID. First of all, we need to understand and sometimes elicit out a history. So there are patients in whom I have seen sleep-wake cycle disturbance, which seems to be the most commonest complaint which I get when patients come to see us as a follow-up. The sleeping pattern, which I'm regularly seeing, and I'm keeping some data of that now, takes probably 3 to 5 months for it to normalize for those patients. They seem to get up in the night. They seem to have a disturbed sleep. It's not a sound sleep. And I will talk to you about myself. It took me good 2 months before I could actually say that I was back to my sleeping pattern of what I had before COVID, when I had COVID in the last May. So I think there is something which now, whether it's just a thought or whether it actually is just the fear or what, but it does actually disturb your sleep-wake cycle. That's one of the things which happens. Obviously, the second thing is this extreme fatigue, and many people almost feel like a chronic fatigue syndrome they are going through. They work for a few hours and they feel that they have worked for a whole day, and they're already tired to the point that they want to now go and lie down completely and not do anything else. And that fatigue is physical as well as it is mentally exhaustive as well. So these two are the commonest things which I see. The other things which are physical, which you talked about in terms of rehab, yes, patients who have got pulmonary involvement, patients who have had probably cardiac involvement, they actually undergo a lot of physical rehabilitation programs for that organ specific thing. There is also something called the critical illness myopathy or a neuropathy, which we see in these patients because they are quite often on on steroids, and they are quite often very, very critical on a ventilator with sedatives and muscle relaxants as well. And we see them requiring long-term rehabilitation in terms of even to the point of walking and being independent again, because they sometimes need oxygen to be taken home with the domiciliary requirement of oxygen, and they take a few weeks to a month just before they can come off the oxygen even after discharge. So these are some of the extremes of the long COVID. Some of the short long COVID things which I am seeing is a few days of fatigue and they come back to normal, or a little bit of an appetite loss that is associated quite often associated with the taste and the smell which they lose. And as that tends to come back, they tend to have their appetite back, and then they tend to have a better bowel and bladder movement as well. They all seem to sort of fall into place once the things settle down. So COVID does have long-term implications, and we probably should not be ignoring them. A lot of physicians need to elicit history, find out. I have had patients who have told me that they keep on getting nightmares, especially those who have spent long times in ICU and who have seen things around them. ICU is not a pleasant place to be in, I will be very honest, because the patient is a very completely different perspective for what a patient actually experiences. On top of that, they are all alone there. In a normal ICU scenario, you would have family visiting you. Here, everything is done on a video call or a video chat, and it is the lack of human touch from the family member point which actually affects them quite a lot mentally.
So another question, I just also put this out there because a lot of people have been asking this on the chat box, is about mucormycosis post-COVID, especially due to the oxygen supply. Is there anything that they can do to prevent this, or is there something that needs to be put in place to ensure that this doesn't become another problem in addition to COVID?
So this is again a question to me.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
this is a question.
Yeah. So, look, mucormycosis. We know from generations together. We've been taught from the MBBS time that mucormycosis is associated with diabetes, most commonly. So, the first thing which we need to realize is that here not only does just being having COVID-19 increases your blood sugar, because the ACE2 receptors are present in the pancreas as well, and many people actually have high blood glucose. We complicate that with the fact that we need to give them steroids. So the blood sugar control goes for a toss. And one of the most important things which we need to do as a patient is keep on being very, very particular about your blood glucose control, especially for those who are treated at home, who are at home quarantine. They may not be on steroids, but keep an eye on their blood glucose, uncontrolled blood glucose. Then when they reach to the hospital, if they're going to get steroids, be particular about the diet. Talk to your doctor about your blood glucose control. Make sure that the blood glucose control is up to the mark. So that's the most important thing. If you can get your blood sugar controlled well, you will not be venturing into the mucormycosis territory at all. The second thing which happens is, obviously, there is a lack of oxygen in many of these patients who are hypoxic. So you could understand that the mucosa also could be a bit hypoxic. And third, we sometimes have patients who have received these further immunocompromising agents, which I just mentioned, IL-6 blockers or agents like them, which can then further lower your immunity and cause something like a mucormycosis. What is interesting is, though, of course, the most common mucormycosis is the rhinocerebral mucormycosis, and I am only seeing rhinocerebral mucormycosis right now. Almost on daily basis, we are operating one case in our hospital, and that's just one hospital. I'm sure there are a number of other hospitals are operating as well, and they are not from our hospital. They're referred to us from wherever. In my group of patients, which we've treated now several thousands of them, we had one patient last July who came in with mucormycosis. Since then, we haven't had any mucormycosis. And what we have changed as a protocol is we try to be very, very particular about glucose control. We try to send patients home, and since last 15 days, we have implemented that policy that patients are going home on insulin actually meet a diabetic educator before they go, so that they know what insulin levels to look for, and they seem to interact a little bit more with an educator rather than with a consultant or a specialist, and that seems hopefully should help. There are other ENT doctors who have suggested us nasal sprays. They have suggested us betadine sprays to keep the mucosa healthy, especially in those patients who have steroids to be given, or in whom we may have used a bit more of immunocompromised agents. But look, I don't know the utility of that. One thing is that since September, we haven't used any other immunomodulator. So no IL-6 blockers, nothing. In September, the only drugs we use is steroid and remdesivir in the group, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit. So moving on to vaccines, Dr. Kang, there is a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions on people's mind about the safety of these vaccines. Are they really safe? Many of them have been developed in record time, and now we are hearing of countries stopping their usage. The European countries put a hold on AstraZeneca. The Johnson & Johnson virus of the vaccine has also kind of been put on hold. So how safe are these vaccines? Should people be worried, or is there a risk-benefit ratio involved here?
So we use the oral polio vaccine. The oral polio vaccine in 1 in a million or 1 in 2 million children can result in polio. The West stopped using the oral polio vaccine decades before we introduced the first dose of fractional IPV in India. We use a lot of vaccines. There is no vaccine that is 100% safe. The vaccine that I work with, rotavirus, the first vaccine was developed in the US, deployed in the US, and then it was withdrawn in the US because of cases of intussusception. and it was estimated that intussusception was happening 1 in 10,000 children who were immunized with the vaccine. Then vaccine trials were done with 60, 70,000 children in order to rule out a safety event that was about 1 in 10,000. And in the phase 3 trials, there were no intussusception cases or no more intussusception cases among the vaccinated compared to the placebo vaccinated children. When those vaccines made by Merck and GSK started to be used in the US, they looked for intussusception and they didn't find it. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then Australia started to see a signal. The US kept looking, didn't find it. 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. In the 7th year, they identified that there was an intussusception signal with both the Merck and the GSK vaccines. They are still using those vaccines. So I think it is a question of when you find the signal that really seems to matter. Once you've got the vaccine into your program, it's established, you can see the benefit of the vaccine, then you become more willing to accept the small risk that may be associated with the vaccine. In this case, what has happened is that actually, if you look at the testing of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, we have tested them like we don't usually test vaccines. Especially vaccines that are going into adults, we don't do 30,000, 40,000, 45,000 people trials. And in those trials, we found no risk, right? When are we seeing the risk? We are seeing risk when Pfizer goes into tens of millions of people. When Moderna goes into tens of millions of people, you can identify a risk of anaphylaxis that is 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 300,000 vaccinated individuals. That is a clear risk. It's predictable. It happens within half an hour of giving the vaccine. You're not seeing the world stopping Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, are we? Right? AstraZeneca, we are seeing this report of thrombocytopenia with thrombosis, and that seems to be antibodies to platelet factor 4. It's very similar to what has been seen with heparin-induced immune thrombocytopenia. It seems to be happening 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 250,000 vaccinated individuals, and we are seeing a hue and cry about this. Why aren't we seeing it with anaphylaxis? Maybe because thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, 20% of patients can die with that without getting to care. Anytime you know that there is a side effect, and you know what the symptoms of the side effect are, and you know what the risk window is, then you can set up mechanisms to control the consequences of that side effect. For AstraZeneca and now for Johnson & Johnson, we know that this happens 4 to 20 days after vaccination. It appears to be more likely after the first dose of the vaccine for AstraZeneca. So if we look at benefit, clear benefit in every age group, in every epidemiological situation, except in young people when there is very little virus circulating. And why is that? That's because the risk of mortality is actually very low in young people in any case. So you're talking about not using the vaccine in a very special situation, which is young people with a low risk of disease-induced mortality and the potential for very limited harm with giving a vaccine. Anytime the risk of disease outside goes up, then again, the benefit-risk ratio is firmly for the vaccine. I'm really sorry for the AstraZeneca vaccine because it's been through so much trouble with all of the various manufacturers and all of the bad news and the mess ups with the testing, with the doses, with the intervals, with this story, with the neurological side effects that weren't. So it's been through a pretty bad time. The good thing that is coming out is now the real world effectiveness data from these vaccines showing that the vaccines are working and they're working against variants. A single dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine is giving up to 80% protection against severe disease and mortality in over 60-year-olds. Remember, AstraZeneca wasn't supposed to be used in the elderly, but in the real world, it's protecting the elderly against severe disease and death. There are now even more questions being raised, which I think are actually somewhat more valid and require investigation, which is, can you give boosters with adenovirus vectored vaccines? That is something that I think we need to wait and see, not so much about the safety concerns. Yes, we need education on safety. Yes, we need monitoring, but I don't think we should be worrying about them to the extent that we decide not to use the vaccines.
Sure. I'd like to just add a follow-up to that question. There are many people who've reported headaches, fevers, body aches following the vaccine, myself included. Why is it that some people have these reactions and others do not? Is it a reflection of their immune system, or is it just idiosyncratic to each person?
It's idiosyncratic and may have a genetic component as well. So I'm sure if you look around you, you know that there are some people who get a cold every year. Some people eat out and get diarrhea, and others who have been with them, nothing happens to them, right? So all of us are different, and that's human heterogeneity. I think in side effects as well, there is a level of heterogeneity, and it does not affect how you respond to the vaccine. So the fact that you were miserable after you got the vaccine does not mean that somebody who was not miserable is not protected.
Fair enough. Dr. Anupa, what would be the ideal time period that you would advise patients to get tested for antibodies post-vaccination?
So I think that's quite known now. When RT-PCR comes positive, day 1 or day 0 of the onset of symptoms, you need to wait at least for 14 days before you think about getting an antibody level checked on a post-infection antibody level specifically. But when it comes to post-vaccination, also there is a requirement, and there are a lot of queries being asked about should we get the post-vaccination antibody level checked or not. But guidelines, I will quote CDC here, does not actually recommend getting the test done. But it is very important to keep in mind that post-infection, there is a different set of antibodies which are seen to becoming positive or reactive as compared to the post-vaccination one. Because the vaccine that we are targeting are all targeting the spike protein. So that may not come positive in your post-infection one on day 1. So we need to be very careful as to how to choose and which antibody level we need to choose. But we need to wait for 14 days at least before we can think about it, before getting the antibody level checked.
Thank you, Dr. Anupa. So I'm getting a lot of questions on the chat box with many people asking about whether they can take the vaccine, whether they cannot take the vaccine. So my question first to Dr. Kang and then later to Dr. Pandit would be, who do you think should not take the vaccine? Let's put it the easier way around. Rather than if I am listing all the conditions who can take the vaccine, who should not be taking the vaccine? Dr. Kang, if you can go first.
The only people who should not be taking the vaccine are the ones who have an allergic or anaphylactic response to the first dose. Other than that, there is no reason for anyone to not take the vaccine. Obviously, if you're currently feeling unwell, then you probably don't want to go out and get vaccinated then. But other than that, there is no reason not to take it.
So let me just ask you another question. So what if you're currently having an infection or you just post an infection? Is that a contraindication for the vaccine?
It's a waste of the vaccine. So what I would advise in that case, what WHO says is that if you have an infection, you can afford to wait 6 months before you get vaccinated, because there are data that show that if you've had an infection, there is about 80% protection for up to 7 months. So the recommendations in India are to wait 4 to 8 weeks before you get immunized after you have tested positive for COVID. I think that's reasonable. And if you want to take a longer break before you get vaccinated, that's fine too.
Dr. Pandit, I would just like to ask, there are a lot of restrictions currently being put. The children should not be vaccinated, lactating mothers and pregnant women, even though for professional organizations like Foxy. Is there any other logic to that, or is it just that we're playing safe currently?
I think there is no data to support that because they were probably not included in the trial. So I completely support what Foxy is saying. If anyways we're saying that if the pregnant women or the lactating women are actually frontline workers, you should be taking the vaccine because the risk of contracting the infection is much higher. Again, pediatric is a whole different ball game. Everybody wants to be so much cautious with pediatric things. There are pediatric trials going on, but I agree with you more or less that everybody wants to be safe when they're going to make a recommendation. There is so much of hesitancy about this whole vaccine, not taking the vaccine, but even delivering it. That everybody has taken a safer approach. We've talked about 3 rooms to be present. We've talked about 30 minutes interval to watch for nobody wants to get anything wrong, which will actually derail the vaccination program. So I think it's important. It's first year. It's only few months, 4 months or so that we've been vaccinating people now. Give it some time, and we've already started having the drive-in and drive-out vaccination drive going in now. Mumbai has got at least 4 or 5 shopping malls where it's happening. So the parking lots have been converted into that. I think we will have, as time goes by, it will become more and more easier.
So just to put it again in summary to the audience, currently there should not be a restriction unless you're allergic. That's the opinion of the consensus opinion here, that you should take that the vaccine should be ideally given to everyone regardless of their category, except maybe children until we have more data. Dr. Kang, would you agree with that summation?
Yes, right now vaccines are licensed for 18 and above in India, 16 and going down to 12 and above in the US. And currently, both Pfizer and Moderna are doing studies to take the vaccines down even lower. So the US is going to be starting with a vaccination program for adolescents shortly. And I expect that other vaccine manufacturers will also be doing the studies so that children can be vaccinated.
Sure. So another question that I would want to put to Dr. Kang is that we keep talking about herd immunity quite a lot, especially since the vaccine drive started, that we should vaccinate enough people to achieve herd immunity. And we have heard it discussed for other viruses like measles, polio, etc. But we don't hear that much about it for H1N1 or other influenza viruses. So is it actually possible to attain herd immunity in COVID, or is this just a fantasy that we're having and this is going to be there for the future? What's the situation look like?
Well, you can achieve herd immunity if you can interrupt transmission of virus by having sufficient people infected. So I actually think it's more likely for SARS-CoV-2 than for influenza, because with influenza, we really have not very good immune responses to flu, and we don't get good protection. The best influenza vaccines give you about 60% protection in a particular year. And that makes it very challenging to get herd immunity for a respiratory virus, for which you need to keep getting boosters. With SARS-CoV-2, the vaccines are doing so well that if we get data on the longevity of the immune response, how long it protects for, I think it's possible that we could be thinking about getting to herd immunity. The problem, of course, is with variants which are more infectious, because as soon as the ability to transmit goes up, then the requirement for the percentage of the population that must be exposed or vaccinated also goes up. So instead of the 60 or 70,000 coverage that we were thinking about last year, we might need to think about an 80 or 90% coverage now. It's important to remember that we have encountered this challenge before for vaccines with measles, where with measles, because it is so infectious, it has a reproductive number of approximately 13 to 15. You need for 95% of the population to be immunized or infected before you get to protection from measles, herd protection from measles.
Thank you for that very clear answer. I think a lot of people's queries would have been cleared with that. We have roughly around 5 minutes left in today's webinar, so I'm just going to put a few questions that the audience has been asking. One is about the efficacy of the vaccines itself. Do either of you, Dr. Kang, Dr. Pandit, do either of you have any particular favorites, if I may ask, in terms of efficacy? Is one empirically is better than the other? Dr. Pandit, if you will go first.
No, I don't have any favorites. I happily took whichever came my way, and that's what I've advised to all my family members, and that's what I advise to all my patients. So clearly, there is no favorite one over the other. Yeah, so whichever comes your way, just take it, please. I don't think there is anything to sort of say that one is better than the other, efficacy-wise at least.
Dr. Kang?
So I agree that right now we should take whichever vaccine we can get, and there is no data to support one over another. I know that in the US, everybody is treating mRNA vaccines like they are something special, but we don't know. Right now, we know only short-term protection from these vaccines. In the future, we may find that duration of protection may be different with different vaccines. So in that case, when we begin to think about booster approaches, then we might want to consider a combination approach or a booster with a certain specific type of vaccine. But at the moment, the first data on boosters is only just coming out with the mRNA vaccines, and we'll have to wait and see what some very interesting studies in the UK will come up with, where they are studying combinations of vaccines made on different platforms. It's a whole new area of study.
I think you were thinking of Sputnik and AstraZeneca being one dose.
So they're doing Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and now they've added Novavax into the mix. So we're going to wind up with all kinds of combinations. And I can just, this is being done by the University of Oxford. So as a lab scientist, you can get very excited about all the immunology that is still to come.
True. There's another question for Dr. Anupa, addressed to Dr. Anupa. They're asking about any particular trends for antibodies post-infection. Is everybody getting the antibody? Or are there people
I lost you. I lost you, Dr. Vineet.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions directed to you from the audience, where they're asking about antibodies post-infection.
Okay, so that's sure. So the trend of antibody post-infection is a very close to my heart topic. The reason being, we conducted a study in our lab. As soon as the antibody test was launched, we conducted this study. Now, in this study, we had a closed group of patients who were RT-PCR positive, and we encompassed age groups between 17 to 64 years adults. And here we had a mixture of both symptomatic and asymptomatic patients, where symptomatic constituted around 68% and 32% were asymptomatic. Now, what we found in this, we followed up with the antibody titer, which is nucleocapsid primarily, qualitative test. We followed them over a period of 1 year, consistently over a period of 6 months. So there were buckets of periods which we actually prepared, like 14 to 30 days was one bucket, second bucket was 30 to 60, then 60 to 90 days. Henceforth, we had up to 6 months, we followed up the cases. So the interesting finding which we found, there were total 94% at the end of 180 days who were seroconverted. Only 6% cases were non-responders or were not seroconverted, as in their antibody titer was negative. Second interesting thing is majority, which is like 73% cases got seroconverted within 14 to 30 days. I think that's a very interesting fact. Third would be there were no gender bias, which we found. There was no correlation seen between the age group, and there was no correlation, interestingly, seen between the CT value and the antibody value. So, which means CT titer and the antibody did not correlate at all in this. We followed a few patients who were positive between 14 and 30 days. We followed them up for 180 days, and what we realized is 87% of them maintained the antibody titer up to 6 months. That is corroborating very well with the other findings which are going on around. But after 360 days, 80% of these early responders, there was a drop seen. So it gives a very good insight, as Dr. Kang was also mentioning. It provides certain kind of immunity to infection or reinfection, which is corroborating with WHO finding as well, where 83% are safe till at least 5 to 7 months. So this was a very interesting finding which we did as a study in Suburban.
Thank you, Dr. Anupa. We are unfortunately short of time. That's all the time we have today. I would like to thank all the panelists for taking time out of their extremely busy schedules for this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Kang, Dr. Pandit, Dr. Anupa, for today's illuminating session. It's been a very sincere session. I would also like to thank all the attendees for their active participation and to answer the queries of many on the chat box. Yes, this webinar, the recording of this webinar will be put up on the website, on YouTube, on our channel, and we will be mailing the link to you. I would again like to thank all of you for today's session. Stay masked, stay home, stay safe. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul, Dr. Vinay.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care.